Good morning, Roger.
Morning. Morning, Toby.
Morning, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, let me put the captions on. I can't hear you. Wait a minute.
Good morning. My name is Roger Williams, and I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Partnerships and Student Resources at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. Thank you for joining us for our fourth annual Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Summit. This has been an incredible week where business leaders and community leaders have leaned into action, intention, and accountability. Today, we'll get a chance to lean a little bit more into action and have discussions about accessibility, neurodiversity, and mental health and wellness. The first panel will be moderated by Temitope Oso. Temitope is a dual degree graduate student in the MBA at the Carey Business School, with also receiving an MS in biotechnology at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. His career path over the years has shifted from microbiology, biotechnology, and his newfound interest in business operations and management, which drove his desire to pursue the MBA at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. He also has been actively involved in various community projects, educating members of the community on issues related to health and social justice. Presently, he works part-time at the Johns Hopkins University Students' Health and Wellbeing, where he manages accommodated test programs for students with disabilities. In addition, he manages the Workforce Recruitment Program, a recruitment program designed for students and recent graduates with disabilities who are eager to demonstrate their abilities in the workplace through summer internships or permanent jobs. Temitope also enjoys traveling and playing soccer. Temitope, welcome.
All right. Thank you, Roger, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. So they say to today's panel on accessibility at the workplace. Firstly, I would like to thank my co-organizer for putting this together, and a special thanks to Roger also for his mentorship and leadership. This particular topic is very dear to my heart because apart being a student here at Johns Hopkins, like Roger mentioned, I also work at the Student Disability Office. And every day I've seen the challenges that a student with disability face on a daily basis. But what is most impressive to me is the kind of empathy and the leadership style of the staff of the Student Disability Office. So in terms of the basic flow of our agenda today, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, which will be followed by, I'll direct some questions to them, and we have the Q&A and the closing remarks from our panelists. So to start off, I will ask each panelist to introduce themselves, a little bit about their background and the work they do. So I'm going to start from Dr. Toby Gordon, who is a professor of practice at the Carey Business School. Dr. Gordon.
Thank you for your nice introduction of yourself and your background. I am a professor at the Carey Business School, as Temitope said. I've actually been at Hopkins over 40 years in a lot of different capacities, and I've had a lot of interest in the last few years in particularly in accessibility and promoting accessibility for everybody for full inclusion as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. You can read my longer bio, but my whole career has been in healthcare, so my interest in disability and accessibility is very much an important part of health and healthcare. So thank you for this opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. Next is Aaron Odukavich, who is the ADA Compliance Officer at the Johns Hopkins University.
Thank you, Temitope, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. And as Temitope said, I'm the university's ADA compliance officer. So in my role, and I've been at the university for 4 years, not quite the amount of time as Professor Gordon, but in my role, I help coordinate compliance with accessibility laws and regulations university-wide. And I also coordinate workplace accommodations for faculty and staff university-wide. And so that is faculty, staff, postdocs, residents, and other trainees.
Thank you very much, Aaron. The next is Kathy Hattie, who is the Executive Director of Student Disability Service at the Johns Hopkins University-wide.
Great, thank you so much, Temitope. And I've had the pleasure to work with Temitope pretty closely over the years. So it's great to be here today and to have this opportunity. I came to Hopkins in about March of 2019. And my background has been for about, 25 plus years working in student disability services. So I've gotten to see an incredible evolution in terms of the changes in the field, in terms of how we regard disability and how we accommodate students in the technologies available. And I'm really excited about a lot of the shifts we are seeing in recent years in terms of universities really turning toward how we can have a fully inclusive experience instead of just accommodating students one at a time. And that proactive work, I think, has been really critical, including programs such as this, where we can help everyone to understand their role in this process. So very excited to be here today. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Kathy. To start our discussion, I would like to ask our panelists to tell us what accessibility means at workplace. I think Dr. Gordon, you can start.
This is like being in class and the roles have reversed and I'm being cold called. Always good to experience the student side of things. For me, accessibility really is very consistent with the concepts of universal design, that everything needs to be accessible to everybody under various, sort of standards and guidelines that have been established. Whether you have a disability accommodation need or not, it's just considered best practice in teaching to have all features of accessibility so people can see, hear, and process information. And there are a number of very specific things that we can do to ensure accessibility. And for those of us on the education side, when we look at principles of universal design and learning, they're the same things that promote the most effective learning. So to me, accessibility is about making sure, particularly now in this digital era, that our digital lives meet all of the accessibility expectations and actually requirements that Kathy and Aaron, as my great supporters and collaborators, are really the experts in this area, but that's what it means to me, that everybody has access, which is relevant, not just because of disability, but non-native speakers, people maybe who maybe you're sitting somewhere and you need to turn the sound off because it would bother other people, but you want to read the captions. So there's a lot of reasons why accessibility is just good education and good business.
Thank you very much.
I was going to add to that. One of the best definitions I've seen of accessibility is actually from the Office of Civil Rights in one of their one of their case settlements. I was going to read it. So accessible means a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. So that's a mouthful, but I think it's a great definition that can actually apply, in the context outside of, EIT, electronic and information technology as well.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And I just might add too that the other aspect of it that's really important is if things are accessible, people don't necessarily need to ask for anything in order to engage with them. There isn't that pre-planning needed to ask for an accommodation. And I was just actually reading a novel the other day that was reminding me of one of the practices that we've tried to sort of start to put in place in programs, and that is to introduce ourselves by also describing ourselves. And if I had done an audio description, I would have said, my name, and then I would have said, I'm a white woman with brown hair in a bob style, wearing a black sweater. And in this novel I've been reading, the person has been introducing all the characters and doing the equivalent of an audio description, obviously in the novel, so it's in print. But it's made me bring the characters to life more in the way the author envisioned them. And it made me realize all these years, I picture people in novels the way I see them and want to envision them. So it was a fascinating shift. But it also helped me to understand that, people are filling in gaps all the time and having to make guesses and assumptions. And this is one way to kind of remove a little bit of that guesswork and also to make people feel they've been recognized and thought about. So again, that's another best practice that, it was a reminder to kind of continue that process.
All right, thank you very much. Okay.
I just want to add one more thing that came into my head, which is, I guess when Kathy mentioned no pre-planning needed, we can have sort of services or features available, like turn on the captions or give out the material, the PowerPoint. So for whatever reason, we all need to read along with it for various reasons. That's just UDL. And these need to be automatic things. We shouldn't have to ask for them. At Carey, Philippe set it up so that the captions are automatically available and the host can turn them on. I go over to the medical school every meeting. No one knows what to do. These are simple things. So we need, part of accessibility is, I think, having that sort of checklist, and everyone needs to do it. But Aaron and Kathy hear this from me all the time, but that's kind of my pitch.
All right, thank you very much.
Sorry, Temitope, speaking of Zoom too, Zoom now is enabled to be like, we can all use captions. We just, as Toby mentioned, they have to be actually turned on in our accounts. But for a long time, they weren't available at all the schools. So now they are universally available. So it's just a question of knowing how.
Right. There's a question in the chat that I won't answer now because Aaron and Kathy really have the master checklist. I sort of make my own and send them over, but they've, and I work with organizations outside of Hopkins, but that's certainly something, we can share. But I'll defer to Kathy and Aaron on the university checklist. And if I think of something that maybe I would personally add, I'll let them know.
All right, thank you very much. Those are great comments, and I believe everyone has a background knowledge of what accessibility means at workplace now. My first question to Dr. Gordon would be, what is the state of accessibility design in the modern workplace?
Boy, I'm kind of in this bubble of Hopkins, but I do interact with the real world from time to time. I think it's very variable. Some organizations, they're very tuned into accessibility, and particularly now with website presences being so critical for every business. There's some that are really doing really great things. There's a company, Decker, that has this incredible, you should be able to go on the website and see the link and either request your accommodation or see all the things that have been done for accessibility. So I think, it's like many things, it's a continuum, and some businesses have really embraced accessibility in the digital world. In the workplace, we can certainly look at Hopkins as an example where we have, fortunately, lots of resources to help us make things accessible. I think small businesses are more challenged in having the resources to study and understand what the requirements are and to implement them. And you see a range, but I think the biggest progress has been in the digital world, which has been a great thing for a lot of people with accessibility needs.
Thank you. I don't know if Aaron or Kathy have any additional comments or that.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I think in the same vein, when it comes to technology and what that enables, I mean, I think we've seen a lot more possibilities from sort of hybrid and remote work that's been made possible with technology advancing. 10 years ago when we didn't have Zoom and we couldn't interact so seamlessly like this on a video chat, things were very different. So, I mean, I think that's another big sort of development, out of the last 2 years is sort of, we've figured out what's possible, doing things remote and not necessarily in person and on site.
All right. Before I move to the next question, there's a question in the chat, but maybe we can address that. We frequently use Teams in our department. Is Teams or Zoom preferred from an accessibility standpoint? That's the first question. Can you think of any other example where we use multiple platforms to accomplish the same thing, and which one is preferred for accessibility?
Try this one. Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I would say from a standpoint of ease of use, and you can correct me, Toby, if I'm wrong, I think that in some ways Teams has better features built in because whoever's in the meeting can turn the captions on without the actual person hosting the meeting doing anything to set them up. Obviously, Zoom is used more readily now, but I like the seamlessness. And let me give it back to you, Toby, because you might have some other perspectives, teaching and all. Yeah.
Well, I have a totally opposite view. I think Teams, the problem I have with Teams is the caption gives you like 2 or 3 lines, and I rely on the captions. So what you do when you're processing, and I can only speak from someone who relies on it from a hearing point of view, is you're listening, you're reading lips, and you're reading the words. And as long as they're kind of synced in real time, somehow your brain puts it together. But often somebody will, and sometimes I'm not really like, this is exactly the question, but I appear not to be like looking at the screen because I'm really listening and I have to kind of concentrate on listening. And sometimes I realize I didn't catch a word, but in Teams, it's gone. Like it's already scrolled on to the next line. So that to me is a real negative. In Zoom, I find the captioning is very accurate. And with the live transcript, if I'm trying to figure out what somebody said, I can look back, and that's just really invaluable. So I have not found Teams functional at all. And then as far as WebEx, so different organizations use different things, and they were using WebEx and could never figure out how to do the captions. And I would raise this issue because I'm on their board. And then they said, well, they were using WebEx because it had better confidentiality features. But then it turned out they didn't really need those features. So I think it's really important, and maybe this is something that's been done, or we could, sort of as far as resources, maybe Teams has features that I'm not aware of because I don't use it that much, but, I think we could define like you need that ability to look at the transcript is really important. And we need to, push people to understand how to use the features and how to activate them. And also just kind of, I think there are lots of, I'll call them products. There's this thing we had once in a faculty meeting where you would go to this website and you would be this avatar and you could move around and go talk to people. It was like this sort of mini virtual reality. It had no captions, it had nothing, so when we deviate beyond the basic things that we use, they really have to be vetted for accessibility. And if they don't have basic features, we shouldn't use them. And just jumping in on a related thing, which is that, especially in teaching, but I think in a work situation as well, it's important to rely on multimodal means of communication. If you have a class, I'll use negotiation as an example. I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk. Well, if you have an auditory problem, that may not really work for you. So we need to mix it up so that work and assignments, can be done in multiple formats. But if it's all relying on one set of sensory neural skills, it can really leave people out. So I'll stop there and let Kathy and Aaron comment. But
well, and I just wanted to follow up because what you pointed out is a really good piece of like how the evolution is changing things. Like I think I'm sort of, looking at Teams from the perspective of it's a more assured way, because I have worked with several people that just definitely can't integrate with the conversation at all without having the captions on. So we relied on Teams because Zoom was so inconsistent, but it's getting more consistent. And your point is well taken about the transcript. This is just reminding me that at events too, when we actually provide transcripts, providing both the link to the full transcript and also the ability to have them at the bottom of the screen so people can choose is one of the best practices we've tried to encourage at events so that people can interact with them in the ways that work best. So thanks again for pointing out the different aspects of it.
Yeah, just one quick related thing. Sometimes we have video material, for example, HR training, videos on schools' websites, and the captions aren't there. So there are sort of jury-rigged ways you can maybe play it in Zoom and look at the captions, but it's sort of back to like standards, like put the captions in the video. Don't rely on it being added because you're happen to be watching it in YouTube or something. So, these are more nuances, but there's just, we need to get people to look at their communication practices and really think about, someone asked about the checklist, and I can speak to the hearing ones and that they may overlap, but, you need the transcripts, the subtitles, you need the materials. Everyone needs the materials in advance. That's UDL. So they're just some basic things. And any sort of websites that we use for activities or whatever, and I'll include the HR, those training videos everyone has to do. There's no transcripts. I could request it and get it, but it just needs to be automatic. And I can only speak for myself. Just let me read that transcript. It'll take 5 minutes and then I don't have to click through a bunch of screens in the training video. So, it's annoying when you have trouble hearing to have to keep listening to a video that goes on and on. So this is phase 2 of my accessibility activism, but we're still in phase 1.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for that great comment. The next question will be for Aaron, and this question relates to the JHO leadership, and I know that they are the ADA compliance officer at Johns Hopkins University. So can you please share with us what Johns Hopkins leadership is doing in accessibility compliance, resources and expertise?
Sure. So I think I mentioned, off the top of the hour that I've been with the university now 4 years. When I came to the university, Kathy's position didn't exist. So my position was also sort of overseeing student disability services university-wide. When I joined, we didn't have anybody, working for the university that was an expert in assistive technology. And we now have an AT accessibility expert in student disability services. So I've seen over the last 4 years some investments in people, which is a great thing, but I think we have a ways to go just in terms of operationalizing a lot of this accessibility, making it, as Professor Gordon pointed out, sort of baked into the way we do things, rather than having people need to request something or to ask somebody to turn something on. So that's where I think we have, a lot of ways to improve. And what I'm hoping, that the next 4 years, we get to a much different place to where a lot of these things are just the way we do things. And it's not, something different or somebody, making a request for us to do something a certain way.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. This is like a follow-up question to the question I just asked you, but I'm going to direct it to Kathy. There's this perception that providing accessibility, it's a work of individual or a particular office, but we know that is not true. Can you please tell us each person's roles in creating accessible workplace?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important aspect, Temitope, because I think the perception over the years has really been, oh, go over there and work with this office if you have those kinds of needs. And I think we really are starting to work much more from a diversity and inclusion lens in terms of understanding people with disabilities are within our community. I think 90% of disabilities are not visible, as an example. So, thinking about these aspects in everyone's workplace is a really critical piece. Being, thoughtful about kind of not leaving stacks of things in the hallway that block passage to get down the hall to reach a faculty member's office. Being kind of aware when you're, again, putting together events to put out a statement that says, if you do need any accommodations or services, here's who you contact and how, so that people know that they're being thought about and considered in this process. People can reach out to Aaron obviously to Toby within the Carey School, to me, to many of the people that they meet in these spaces, because we're always glad to talk and think through if someone has a question or is unsure. We have a central website called accessibility.jhu.edu, and we're about to launch a SDS central website. Those will contain resources, events. I also encourage people to attend events, learn about various aspects of how we can make our environment more accessible. The people here today are doing just that, because I think before we can do something to actually have an impact, we have to even know what are the barriers, what are we talking about? And I think if someone hasn't experienced them, it can be very easy to overlook them. And that's not from any kind of a blame standpoint. It's hard for things to be in our consciousness if we haven't actually had direct experience. And so that's why engagement, attending events, learning about things is so critical. We're learning every day. I learn something new as I interact with people throughout my workday. And that's really because information and change is so quick. We have to be listening and aware and keeping on top of things. So I think also when you notice something, say something, reach out to us, let us know if you think it's a broader issue, speak to someone within your sphere if there's something you think that could be done, in-house right then. Captioning is a great example. It's missing in a lot of places where it should be, and this takes people noticing before they post. And that extra step of captioning doesn't have to be hard. Both of our offices, Aaron and I both know how to get it done quite easily. So again, just seeking information when you need it, I think, is also everyone's responsibility and role. Knowing enough to know there's a barrier, and then seeking information about how you can effectively remove that. And you don't have to do it alone. We're all working as collaborators and partners, because this is really a shared responsibility.
Can I just add a few more comments on that? So first of all, Kathy and Aaron are just great, and they're great collaborators and resources. And I call them, they probably funneled my email into some spam folder because I email them and call them all the time, but they're really great, and they've taught me a lot. And just a couple points I wanted to make. We're talking a lot about accessibility to get the job done, to be a student, to be a professor, to do your job. But there's this whole other level. This might be accessibility level 3. We're not there yet, but when you think about the environment, and what triggered this thought was when Kathy mentioned, don't leave things in the hallway. So my metaphorical example is at the Baltimore Museum of Art. There's a new exhibit that was curated by people that the guards in the building, and they sent them to training, and they spent a year, and they've curated an exhibit of artwork that was important to them. It's amazing. And, there are a lot of things that people with disability and accessibility issues have related to just being in the environment. I'm really conscious, will I hear the fire alarm bell go off? How will I know? Is the light that will flash nearby? So there's many other levels that we haven't talked about that are beyond just getting the work done. You're walking to your car, you might not hear somebody coming up behind you. So there's just this kind of other level, or you might not see somebody, or maybe if you have a mobility challenge, there's just this whole other level that I think we need to think about, because that's also part of just people feeling comfortable in the environment. And then the other thing I wanted to say was, we've talked, I think a lot of the examples certainly that I've been using are kind of about, I'll call it sort of long-term disabilities, and maybe they're going to progress and get, have more, they might get, your disability might worsen over time. But there are also a lot of short-term disabilities, like long-term COVID and things like that. We haven't really talked about that, and that's maybe a dimension around fatigue or other things. And I just wanted to put that out there, that maybe that's not our topic for today, but I think part of our understanding and thinking about accessibility is, beyond maybe some of our traditional concepts. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you for that great comments. Now, I'll still comes back to you, Dr. Gordon. So there's a recent report by the US Bureau of Statistics that the unemployment rates among persons without disability is 12.6%, whereas for persons with disabilities, it is 7.9%. Which brings me to the questions that what are the possible solutions for the unemployment rate among the people with disability?
Yeah, I'll give a quick opinion, but Kathy and Aaron may have studied this area more than I have. Certainly employers, there are a lot of good examples, and I think good examples are what we learn from, and testimonials of like companies that have like figured it out. So who are they and what have they done? How have, I think an example might be people that may have a neurodiversity disorder are really good at a certain type of job, and they've been recruited into those types of jobs because they have a certain skill set that goes with their sort of cognitive abilities. I'm speaking in vague terms deliberately because I don't want to say the wrong thing. If you're really good at details and that happens to be one of your focal points, so I think that so that's just maybe one example of, certainly changing definitions of what a job needs and who can do it. And in Maryland, I think the governor's saying there's a lot of jobs in the state. You don't really need a college degree for that. That may strike a blow to Hopkins or to institutions, not really, but we have to really rethink, are we putting up barriers that we don't even know we've put into place? So that's the first thing, like figure out the barriers and try and get rid of them. And then, figuring out, how can we attract, recruit, train, what sort of training and development might need to be put into place. If you look at other countries and how they handle it, there are many different examples. I happened to be looking at some German disability law policies yesterday, and they have, quotas and things like that. So there are a lot of policy tools as well. I can't really speak to any of them, but I think it starts with companies just saying, it's like looking at any underrepresented group. We need to figure out the barriers and fix it. And I would say we should be doing that for all underrepresented groups, not just disability.
Thank you. Aaron, I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, I wanted to add, the ADA, Title I of the ADA is purely on employment. And one of the, when the ADA was passed, that was one of the original intentions, was to really try to increase, the employment of people with disabilities, and that wasn't happening. And we all saw in 2008, that led Congress to have to pass the ADA Amendments Act, which, really made it clear that they intended, disability to be defined broadly and to be, covering a wide number of people. And so I think since 2008, the folks that actually do workplace accommodations, we focused more on, what's reasonable in the particular context, rather than what medical documentation, do you have that says X, Y, Z.
Do you have any comments, Kathy?
Yeah, just from like the students in an employment standpoint, I've worked with a lot of students with disabilities over the years, and I do think there are still some barriers, in particular for students with visible disabilities. Like I've watched, Ivy League graduates that have really struggled to find employment because, for example, they had cerebral palsy and had, their speech wasn't as traditional and typical, or they used a wheelchair and were limited sometimes by the places they could work based on the accessibility of some of the organizations. Some of them, wanted to work for small nonprofits that lived in very small spaces, some of which in the area we were in New England, they were really old buildings. So I think there are these barriers, and sometimes, it's not overt, the reasons why someone isn't hired. But I think, again, the patterns we've seen again and again show that employers are sometimes not comfortable. They're not familiar with what would be needed. They anticipate accommodations would cost far more than they do. I think there's a pretty consistent statistic that most accommodations cost $500 or less. And I used to work in workplace accommodations, so I saw that that was frequently the case. But also working with managers and supervisors, and there is this anticipatory piece when people are unfamiliar. And I think this is where the education is really critical. And I also worked with the Job Accommodation Network a lot, and I really encourage students and managers to talk with them, because there are resources available where you can talk very openly about what the challenges are, especially for students looking at jobs, deciding when and how and if to disclose. There are many elements of that, especially if it's an invisible disability. And I do think rethinking our traditional ways of assessing people. I used to work with a lot of students that couldn't manage those entrance exams into consulting firms, for example, or the intensity of the work was such like at such an acute pace that they were really losing some really incredible students that just needed to be able to take care of themselves and manage their mental health or their medical condition, for example. So I think we just really need to rethink, why are we doing what we're doing? Is it important? Is it critical? Sometimes, but maybe not always. And how do we make things, more inclusive from that standpoint? Like I like what Toby was saying, it's really thinking about removing barriers, because it's the barriers that are disabling.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have something to say, Dr.
I do.
Okay.
I feel like I'm being the teacher. I'm going to call on Aaron in a minute, talk about a case that he discusses in one of his trainings. But I've personally heard this a lot, and I think people hear it a lot. And Kathy brought it up, which is people say, "Oh, we can't afford that accommodation. It's too expensive," and that's another barrier, and it's a real sign of true lack of understanding of what you like. That's not your decision. If you're people are trying to make decisions and use that as excuses to not do something when that's really not right. And that's not actually what's in the case law. So I'm going to punt to Aaron to talk about the Searles case. Because this is probably one of the most important things for people to understand, to not just say, "Oh, we can't afford that."
Yeah, I mean, I'll take, just to touch on this topic for a minute, for an employer, employer with more than 15 employees, we're covered under the ADA. And so that means we need to provide, reasonable workplace accommodations, that enable somebody to perform the essential functions of their position, unless doing so would rise to the level of an undue hardship. And in the employment context, in that undue hardship, I mean, you're looking at the resources of the entire employer, not just a particular department or small, office. And so when we're looking at, accommodations that, and as everybody stated, the vast majority of accommodations are little to no expense, but there are accommodations that are, more costly. And that's why we need to, as an institution, have a process in place to absorb those costs so that they're not just falling on smaller departments or offices, because we know what that leads to. That leads to exclusion and people not getting hired.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Because of time, I think since we are talking about unemployment, it is better we talk about the performance evaluation for persons with disability. And everyone, feel free to jump on these questions. In what ways can employer approach employees' job performance evaluation to ensure fairness and equity in the evaluating process for persons with disabilities?
Maybe I'll start and then again toss it to Kathy and Aaron. As I think about it, as someone who has, working on kind of the business side here, we have to think about what we say in the job description and whether or not those statements are perhaps unnecessary or discriminatory related to somebody's functional skills. And the same with, I think, the evaluation process and how that's done. And so I think it's kind of in that same theme of, prospectively looking at potential barriers or issues, because, we want to be able to evaluate people and their ability to do the job. And I assume, and this is where Aaron and Kathy will have to weigh in, without penalizing them in any way because of whatever accommodation, whether it's, needing to take time off or take longer to do something. So I don't really know how that plays out in kind of the real world, but I would assume there are kind of systematic approaches that could be taken to make sure that the process is as fair and unbiased as possible.
And I can't tell you how often, job descriptions don't get updated over the years, right? So, sometimes, people reach out to our office and, it's part of that interactive process. We get a copy of their job description. It hasn't been updated in 20 years. And what they do today, is nothing like is what's written on that job description. So, it's important to update job descriptions over time. And look at those requirements. I mean, sometimes, job postings have requirements that have little to no relevance to the real job. I mean, sometimes they require a driver's license, and a lot of times, if you look at the nature of the role, it's really not necessary. So rethink, what you're making requirements as far as, the job description also.
And I just wanted to add to creating an environment where people can and feel safe asking for accommodations when they need them is critical as well. Because in my experience working with employees over the years, sometimes people didn't feel comfortable asking. And then when something wasn't working was often when the need for an accommodation came out. So again, for employers, understanding how difficult it can be to ask for things sometimes is part of it. It's not just that the employee has had a difficult, review and is now kind of bringing it up as an excuse. It's really a lot of times driven by the climate and how easy it is to speak up. And I also encourage employers not to wait if things are not going well and to ask someone, questions about, what do you need? I've noticed that X, Y, and Z wasn't getting done. Let's talk about it. Is there something you need? Because again, being able to kind of step into that space and ask for an accommodation. If someone says, yes, I'm working in a cubicle, I could really benefit from having less of a distracting space when I need to work on these reports. I think I'm making more mistakes because I'm not able to focus. That type of conversation sometimes doesn't happen as quickly as it could. And so again, many employers will notice, but not know what to say. And I think you don't have to question someone about, do you have a disability, but you can talk about what you're noticing in the performance. And that can create a space. It also makes employees feel noticed and heard and thought about. Yep.
Yeah, I think another dimension, and I'm only going to raise this as like yet another topic for further discussion, but when you work, you need the support and collaboration and essentially compliance of your coworkers. If I go to a meeting and the captions aren't on, I can't do my job. I'm obviously making up this example. So, supervisors and employers may not really be aware of the climate, but that's a really important thing. And I'll let Karen and Kathy and Erin talk about how we do that, but it ranges from microaggressions and implicit bias, and if you're kind of in the minority as a person with any disability or accommodation need, and especially if you're new and you don't have your support system, I think these are there needs to be a supportive environment, but also how do you as the employer get the people in the workforce without revealing confidential information? How do you make the environment work? And my view is if you make it work for everybody, UDL, like, if you're in a cubicle and it's really noisy and you can't hear, well, that's probably a problem for everyone, not just the person with the hearing problem. So I'll toss the ball back to Erin and Kathy, but those were just some thoughts that climate and environment, and maybe we'll do a whole session another day on microaggressions, but they need to go away.
Yep. Before we move on to the next question, we do have a question in the chat box. The question is, when thinking of universal design, there is often the belief that something doesn't have to be done because there is no immediate need. So how do we encourage department to go beyond requirements?
It has to come from the top. That's the only way. Leadership has to say, we're going to do this. So we don't have to say, oh, now you need it, so now we're going to get it for you. We have to raise the standards for everybody. And if we're down in some department and the need's not seen, everybody's busy, there's always a million reasons why, but the culture has to be set at the top, or we're only going to make little tiny bits of progress.
Yeah, and it's kind of like waiting to put in wheelchair accessibility until you have someone arrive with a wheelchair. It's not going to happen in a timely fashion. And also, maybe there were people that approached that used a wheelchair that you didn't even see, that just were like, oh, I won't be able to enter this space. So it's really impossible to even assess the impact you're having. That's why accessibility has to come first, why we have to plan for people to be able to access things in multiple ways. And I like that there's a lot of research now, for example, on everything from curb cuts and how they've helped everyone from delivery drivers to mothers to people that use a scooter or walker, even, just make it easier to roller skate and skateboard. Sometimes we don't want those people using the sidewalks, but I think it really helps everyone. And I think the same with when we're thinking through accessibility and universal design. We've seen lots of research. I mean, I get access to that. Maybe that's things we could share more often about how it improves learning, because really most of us traditionally don't learn in the same way. We benefit from some things more than others. And so if you're only using a few modes, you're losing a fair percentage of your students in terms of their engagement.
Yeah, if I can just
I would also go ahead, Professor.
I was just going to add one comment. So I'll be in a meeting, in a room, I was in this class in a physical space the other night. And eventually said, I can't hear anything. And then everybody else goes, oh, I can't hear either, but nobody will speak up. So, it's sort of to that, people are afraid to speak up, even if they don't, just under general circumstances, they can't hear. It has nothing to do with their hearing abilities. So, we need to kind of do more things like checking in and finding out and not making assumptions, doing sound checks. Can everybody hear? Can you see? Did you have, did you have trouble getting in? You walk into the Carey building, there's a flight of steps. So if you need to take the elevator, I think someone has to like help you get to the elevator. It's, so we need to do more conscious sort of looking at barriers and things that, again, yes, there's an elevator, but does it make it seem, is it really easy to use?
All right. Helen, you're up.
I was just going to briefly mention, when something's not readily accessible, it's not a welcoming environment. And so, to say, well, hey, people aren't here. I mean, you're not making it a welcome environment for people. So.
Okay, just a quick question before we move to from the chat box, and it's on recruitment and job description. So we have the CatMat gender decoder to check for gender biased language in job description. Is there a tool like this for accessibility or other resources to check this?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The checklist as far as the job description, like the important things to include in a job description?
Yeah, the question is, there is CatMat gender decoder to check for gender biased language in job description. So is there a tool like this for accessibility?
I'm not aware of an automated tool, if that's that sort of automated tool. So no, I mean, in terms of job description itself, I always say, what are the essential job functions? I mean, what does this job need to do? And that's what needs to be included. And then, looking to the essential requirements again, what are truly essential and what, are nice to have.
Maybe the job description should include what the employer is going to do. Like, we commit to X, Y, and Z, UDL, accessibility, it's sort of a two-way street. Like, we're looking at you, can you do this job? But we need to say what we're willing to do and make that clear to get that conversation going around needs that people, you make assumptions about what will or won't be there. And I think we have to be more explicit. And maybe that's part of building the accountability into the organization when we get all these job descriptions updated, that people really understand, what we're committing to do and what you should do if you need help or something.
But I like the idea of a flagger that might actually sort of make you stop and question, wait, you've added a lot of, physical requirements. Are these truly needed? And I think it's stopping to think about the things that people put in with a point. Like, I know for many, many years, we'll just use medical schools broadly as an example. They had written into their essential requirements things like seeing and hearing in a way that really precluded people, whole groups of people with disabilities, from being able to participate in the ways that they clearly can. And I think just stopping to think about, are there any pieces of your job descriptions, probably older pieces sometimes too, that you've just not stopped to rethink? Like, are they really needed? And the way they're worded also, is it an essential function? Because sometimes there are pieces of a job that maybe isn't so critical, and that is a piece that could be reallotted to someone else. So again, being open to those pieces and maybe less traditional ways of getting aspects of the job done are possible now. We saw this when we all moved remote, and nobody thought that that could work in the ways that it did, right? And now we all find aspects of it very inclusive and welcoming and flexible. I think we've hired a bunch of people at Hopkins that we wouldn't have hired if we'd had everybody had to have moved, right? And so I think this has really opened things up, and continuing to think about that in regard to our jobs too. Can they be done differently? Is there flexibility?
There's also another part of job descriptions, and this is particularly relevant, I think, in medicine, which is that sometimes jobs require a credential that you're going to get from a third party. And I'm involved with some organizations nationally that oversee things like residency education. So that cultural change, so that the barriers are existing in getting these other credentials before you even get to applying for the job. So part of maybe a broader advocacy is, okay, do you really have to have that to get this credential, whether it's your nursing license or your board certification? So it's a much bigger thing, but I think part of the review process could be what third-party requirements have we built in, and do those have barriers? That's almost like Governor Hogan saying, okay, you don't really need college degrees for all this. I'm a proponent of licensing and professional certification, but I just think it's something to become aware of that could be a barrier as well.
And then I'm going to chat a disability language style guide that comes out from the National Center for Disability Journalism, because I do think it provides some helpful terminology, because I know this can be an area, it's often changing. It's also very person specific. So again, taking cues from the person with a disability as to how they reference themselves, whether they use disabled or person with a disability. Many aspects of that are very nuanced, but this guide could be helpful. I don't know that you'll be putting any of this in a job description, but again, it could be helpful for you just in terms of navigating things on the job.
Thank you, Kathy. Because of time, I do have a final question for Kathy before I move to the general question for everyone. As one of the students that works in the SDS, I've seen some of the resources that are available to students, including assistive technologies. But I do know that these students will not remain here forever. So how does Student Disability Service prepare students for the workplace settings in terms of recruitment, onboarding process, and their rights at workplace?
Yeah, so I should probably give a piece of this back to you, Temitope, because you run the workforce recruitment program. So I think part of what the office does is it partners with Life Design Lab to include their staff in, our processes within disability services. So they understand and have the ability to support students in a more nuanced way. We do participate with programs like the Workforce Recruitment Program, and there are many others like it that we can refer students to as well, that are looking really to kind of create opportunities for students to get experience, test out accommodations. The Workforce Recruitment Program is a federal government program, which is actually designed to enable students really who may need a higher level of accommodation that might be hard to put in place for an internship or a short-term role, to really work with employers that have agreed proactively that they're ready and prepared to do that. So it's a great testing space for students to just get used to using that type of language in the workplace and understanding kind of how to navigate that. So I think pieces like that have been really critical. And then I think there is more work for us to do. This is one of the things we're doing, is we're increasing capacity within student disability services, is working to have the staffing in place so we can work more closely with students and understand both their interests and their passion, and also have the time and energy to be able to help to continue to connect them throughout their time at Hopkins to various opportunities. Because I think there are so many different ways. I think we could be involved with programs like Lime Connect is another great example. They work with some really, creative and interesting employers that are innovators in the fields they're in. And so I think we want to make sure students actually can not just work with the federal government and their affiliates, but also really, be out in the workplace in the ways that many of them want to be. And again, having great experience as you go is really critical to that. So I do think, everyone needs experience these days. And I think making sure that experience is a good one is a good starting point. So I'm excited you've had such a role with us in that regard, because that's a really critical piece. And do you want to add anything in terms of your experience and anything else? Because you might be able to speak a little bit more to what's happening at SDS Homewood.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I would just say, for the workforce recruitment program, it really gives student opportunity, for them that wants to really showcase their talents in the workplace. We prepare them through the recruitment process, the application process, and as well, we even go as much as linking them with employers through the workforce recruitment features. So that's one thing I believe that the Student Disability Service is really doing in terms of preparing students for the workplace settings. I'll just move straight to the final question I have for all the panelists, and it's something I read recently. There's a celebrity that recently disclosed that he had just learned about his learning disability. And this helped him make sense of his lifelong struggle with communication. So how can we educate ourselves about our blind spots on disabilities?
Well, I think knowing a little bit about the history and sort of where we're coming from in terms of where culturally we've been sort of educated. This speaks a little bit to what Toby was saying about microaggressions and things that people have been, like jokes people have grown up hearing, comments people make without thinking about it. Those types of things I think really do kind of color experiences. And so I think being able to kind of understand and notice that is a really helpful, starting point. And then I think really continuing to learn and engage. We have a lot of programming on this campus that is really interesting in terms of learning about various types of research, types of disability, types of lived experiences. And I think wherever people can have exposure to people sharing their lived experiences, that to me is the most powerful type of education because, again, we want to make sure that that sort of, very common statement, nothing about us without us, is really kind of front and center in this work, because we do want to make sure that the people with disabilities, especially because in such a changing world, we're moving all the time, and it's good to know like what's your current experience like, and also to be really able to I think make our workplaces inclusive. We have to understand about people's experiences. So I think we are doing more work right now within the roadmap to get more information, collect better data, understand people's experiences more, and then be able to make changes and prioritize the changes we're making now. But I think those are some of the starting points that come to mind for me.
Thank you so much.
I'm thinking this is kind of a hard question because we do all have blind spots, and having the training and chance to, the most valuable learning experiences are experiential, when you can engage with people with different backgrounds and experiences. So, all the things Kathy mentioned relate to that. But I also think, putting on a business hat, that there has to be accountability. If someone's committing microaggressions or ignoring, and we see this, unfortunately, and there's an accommodation request, it gets ignored or only partially adhered, it's not okay. And until we start to say, you must comply, you must do these things, I'm not necessarily a believer that, okay, everyone must do training and therefore you will know these things, but the training's there to make sure that you will be held accountable. And we don't have that yet. So I think until we get to that, it's part of it being baked in. There's things you can't say or do. There's things you must do. You must respect the accommodation requests, and it just has to be embedded into how we manage, or we're just going to spend a lot of time, learning from each other, and that's lovely and wonderful, and it'll get a little better. But, until people know like this, and I'm not talking about the egregious problems that probably do get addressed, but we just have to raise the bar on, this is modern management. You have to know this stuff. And it's not just disability, it's all across DEI, but it has to be a professional requirement to do your job, to know what to do and what not to do.
Thank you so much. I think that would be, I think that would be our final question because of the time. So thank you all for a great panel. And if you want to learn more about accessibility, please refer to the SDS website. Let us all do our part to provide accessible environment for all. I'm going to hand over to Roger now.
Thank you, Temitope. I want to thank Temitope and the panel for a very, very educational conversation. Thank you for keeping the context in terms of intention, action, and accountability. I want to really thank Dr. Gordon for keeping the focus on accountability, not only from a leadership perspective, but also from a personal perspective. So, so thank you for the conversation today. I want to move into our next session. So I want to introduce our next presenter, our student presenter, Tahisi Sharma. Tahisi is currently pursuing her MS in healthcare management. Prior to joining the Carey Business School, she was working as a quality supervisor, leading a team of 20 quality control analysts in the pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in Singapore. She majored in engineering biotechnology during her undergraduate study. She holds an internal position of vice president, community engagement with the women in business, and director of marketing at Carey's Net Impact. So she's not only a student, she's in 2 student organizations. She has also been greatly passionate about health equity and making a difference in society that she resides in. She has volunteered in various nationwide programs during her undergraduate study and was an active Red Cross volunteer during her work tenure in Singapore. She hopes to bring about a systemic change in healthcare access to socioeconomic classes and is focused on mitigating all health inequities related to challenges, promoting the idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Thank you, Roger. Good morning, everyone. Today amongst us, we have Jessica Lee, co-founder and executive director of NeuroTalent Works, a nonprofit organization advancing neurodiversity inclusion in the workplace and connecting employers to the neurodivergent talent. A proud alumni of University of Southern California and UPenn, she worked with Capgemini as a consultant and project manager with SoCalGas. She wants to change the societal perception of autism and developmental differences and wants employers to focus on implementing strategies with neurodiversity in mind. In today's session, Jessica will introduce us to neurodiversity and how neurodiversity can be incorporated in the workplace. Without further ado, I present to all of you, Jessica Lee.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for, inviting me to be here today. I'm so excited. I think the panel before really set the tone and actually covered some of the topics that I was going to discuss today. So it's a really great context. Just so excited to be here and to jump in. As Tejasvi mentioned, my name is Jessica Lee. I'm co-founder and executive director of NeuroTalent Works. And we are advancing neurodiversity inclusion in the workplace. So give me 1 second here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and I'm hoping everyone can see this. I'm going to be moving pretty quickly because I know our time is short and I want to make sure that there is time for question and answers. But first I'll say, happy Friday. It's April 1st. I can't believe it. And it's also the start of Global Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month. Today is the global day for recognition. And so I want to just say it's very timely and the perfect date for us to be having this conversation. So as mentioned, our organization, NeuroTalent Works, is a nonprofit. We're based in Los Angeles, but starting to really work across the country because of the pandemic, just a lot more remote work. And we're really here to connect neurodivergent and autistic individuals into employment. We started the organization focused in autism, but we're now really moving beyond that to neurodiversity at large. So just a really quick agenda. I'll talk a little bit about what neurodiversity is, what it really means to have a diversity of minds in the workplace. And I think this is applicable to classrooms and to students as well. And then what are some inclusive workplace practices? So thank you again for your time and to be here. So just from a language perspective, we get asked a lot about, what terminology do we use? And so just to lay the groundwork for this, neurodiversity is really a term that's used for groups of people and at large when we talk about embracing a diversity of minds and kind of this movement towards inclusion and belonging for individuals that have any type of intellectual or learning difference and developmental difference of their brain. Neurodivergent is the term that you might use to talk about an individual who is, autistic or maybe dyslexic or even have traumatic brain injuries or any type of information processing difference. And of course, there's person first language, an individual with autism or autistic. And every individual in our community has a different preference to this. And so you might hear me interchangeably using it as well. But again, I think that's a nod to what was said earlier about really having our community represented in our work and having their voice at the center of it. And so just being respectful and knowing that that's what you might encounter if you do meet somebody who is neurodivergent, that there is personal preference to those types of identification terms used. So how do we think about this from the lens of DEI? You know, again, I think that there's been a lot of great discussion about accessibility and disability at large, and oftentimes it's a lot of the, I would say, focus has been in the disability space on those with a physical disability, where we really promote neurodiversity and what it means to have a developmental difference, and the difference and the complexity that this can bring in a DEI context, where so much of the focus of DEI has been on more apparent diversities like identity diversities, gender, race, even physical disabilities, where you're able to kind of identify and see that and have that empathy in many ways, or awareness to it. Cognitive diversity, neurodiversity, is less apparent. And so this demands workplaces, schools to think about what inclusion means in a completely different way. It asks us to have to approach work differently, to approach how we communicate and work with one another. And I think the panel before really started to set the tone for that. So hopefully this digs in a bit deeper to it, but this is where we really are advocating for neurodiversity to have a seat at the table in DEI conversations, and why it's so important too. So I was going to take this out, but I see that we do have a chat here, and I apologize for those who may be difficult of seeing this image, but this is an image that went viral, and feel free to participate in the chat if you would like to. It's a picture of a dress. And the question here would be, you know, what colors do you see in this image of this dress? And I promise there's an activity coming that for those who may be hard of seeing would be able to participate as well. Okay, so thanks for those that are participating in the chat. I see a lot of blue and black for the color of this dress. All right, one gold and white. Oh, two coming in. Great. Thank you so much for your participation. So this image is something that went viral a few years ago. And as you can see in the chat, and as you're hearing me say, a lot of different views of seeing different colors. Blue and black and gold and white are typically the colors that are seen when someone sees this image. And this is just one example of what it means for our brains to literally develop differently, where our eyes filter in colors in a different way. And so we might see this image in different colors. There's no right or wrong, right? There's just a difference in how we see the colors of this dress, but us being aware of it is really important. And it gives us some context to understanding, you know, someone else might not know looking at me if I see white or gold or blue or black. So it really challenges us to think about what this really means to have a developmental difference and to have these diversities. So how do we accommodate for this, and how do we think about this in the workplace or in school? So again, you know, we focus on autism, a lot of the conversation today, because it is one of the larger groups within neurodiversity. And, you know, earlier there was the quote, "Nothing about us without us." This is another really pertinent quote of, if you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism. And it's so important because it is not a linear spectrum. It is truly, you know, I had a self-advocate who was speaking with me, and she found this image and said, this image really helps me to understand my own brain, and that in all of these different functions that our brain is, you know, responsible for, all these cognitive functions, that, yeah, it varies for me, and it's going to look different for the next person who's autistic as well. But to give context to autism, for those who may not be as familiar, some of these cognitive differences that we might see, one is in social skills. And this is what I've heard from our community is differences in picking up on social cues and even reading facial expressions, that some of us can like look at someone's eyes and be able to know how they feel or what they're thinking. And for our community, it's harder to pick up on those expressions to interpret what is behind, you know, that the emotion behind that person's facial expression, even body language and sarcasm, where many in the community take what you say at face value. And so we always advise to speak directly and explicitly, and to be really specific and detailed in how we talk and how we give directions in our work, and that's really helpful for the community. Executive function. So this is part of the brain that plans, organizes, problem solves, and manages our time. So an example of this is, for many of us, where in our bodies, we can feel what 15-minute feels like. I can go about, cleaning the house and know about how many minutes is 15 minutes. I feel it in my body. Well, for many in our community, they've shared that they don't feel that. They don't have that sense of time that they can feel in their bodies. And so it's really helpful for them to have, there's a really cool gadget of a clock that you might imagine like the typical timer that's ticking, that's like really annoying for some people, myself included, but they have ones where you move the timer and it's showing visually, almost like a pie chart, the time that is decreasing over time. And you can have that sitting on your desk. Those are examples of some of these accommodations that do not have a financial burden on a business or to any of us, that are really helpful. And so things like that, and starting to understand how these things are different for those that are in our neurodivergent community. And then sensory sensitivity to noise, light, touch. And you may see individual stimming, which could look like rocking back and forth. And that is a self-stimulatory activity. It's similar to how some of us bite our nails or pace around in circles when we're nervous. It's something we do physically in our bodies to really self-soothe. And so, just understanding some of those behaviors. And sorry, I'm going really quick because of our time crunch, but just to give some examples of that. And so, why is this so important to address, and why did we start our organization? Currently in the US, the CDC just published this number in December. 1 in 44 children in the United States are born on the autism spectrum. 5 years ago, when we started this organization, it was at 1 in 89. So a lot of different reasons why we can be seeing this growth in prevalence, probably mostly because of the earlier diagnoses that are happening, and the sophistication of the diagnoses tools. And I'm talking to the experts here on that. And what happens is there are a lot of services for children, but upon graduating high school or college, they drop off what we call the service cliff. There's just much fewer services available for adults, and also this expectation of independence and employment. And so this has led to an 80% unemployment rate in the country. And of those employed, 50% are underemployed. We meet candidates who have bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, that are working at fast food chains or in grocery stores. And though those are good jobs, they're not being fully leveraged for their skills, their education. And as a society, as taxpayers, this is almost $200 billion annually that we pay. And this is an unemployment rate from before the pandemic. We can only imagine what it looks like today, even though it is a very hot market right now to be a job candidate. Our community is still severely underemployed. And so that's why we're here to educate and talk about how do we understand this and what are the barriers that we can remove. Really quickly here, a lot of employment for just our disability community in general, and those that are autistic, has been in the service sector. And there are also social ventures that have popped up, which are offices of all people with disabilities or autistic people who are performing outsourced services to companies. Our focus is really the corporate sector, integrated, inclusive workplaces, and extending the spectrum of jobs for those that are on the spectrum. And really bridging this gap and connecting neurodivergent talent to companies and helping them to understand how to be inclusive. So we talk about some of the interesting aspects of our brains developing differently. And we can't draw a broad stroke and say everybody who is neurodivergent has these gifts, but there is a lot of perspective that comes from developmental differences, and some that are gifts that are maybe beyond and advanced in terms of like the neurotypical mind versus a neurodivergent mind. first and foremost, and this is what we use to talk to companies about the business case for this. Why do we need to invest in this talent pool? Innovation. Companies are always investing in innovation. And the definition of it is that you have a diversity of minds and perspectives brought to, a creative solution. And that is exactly what neurodiversity is. And someone had just sent me an article yesterday about, on LinkedIn, that dyslexic strengths are now a strength on LinkedIn because of the innovative perspective that those that are dyslexic might bring and see in a certain situation. I'm going to go through these quickly. Detail and accuracy. For many in our community, ability to focus for longer periods of time and to see the details. I had a young man who shared with me when he was a child, his parents would take him on a walk to the park. And he said, when I was looking down at the concrete, I didn't see like this big gray slab of concrete. I saw the little cracks in the concrete, and my brain, that's what focused, that's what my eyes focused on. And I had to learn to zoom out, but it's still hard for me. And so for him, he sees the details. That's naturally a part of how his brain has developed. And those are some strengths that can really be capitalized on too. In a similar way, visual spatial thinking, being able to see data patterns in a completely different way, and being able to go deeply into subject matters that are really of interest to our community. In children, you might see, this really deep knowledge of cars or trains, coral reefs. My good friend Alex, who's an amazing TED Talk speaker and is autistic, where she was she just came across coral reefs and went so deeply into that knowledge and discovered something amazing about them and presented a paper to the UN at 16 years old. I mean, amazing. You have to Google her, Alex Generous, to watch her videos. But these are, really important aspects of neurodiversity that we can all really consider. And again, there's so many other things to talk about of why there is such benefit to us to have neurodivergent individuals and their, contributions to our society, to our workplaces. What we always share with companies and with all of you is, you're not the first to the table. There's been a really, these are pioneers, I would say, in the neurodiversity inclusion space. SAP really having been the one that led the way globally for this work. And even, my favorite story here is the Australian and the Israeli Departments of Defense. They're solely hiring individuals on the autism spectrum to look at geographical information system data because they see the topography in a completely different way. We recently learned that the CIA here in the US also has employed some autistic individuals because of that unique perspective and skill set that they bring. And so this is something that, we really want companies to understand and to see why there's benefit to this. So just to get deep, go a little bit deeper into this, and someone had brought this up earlier about universal design. What does it mean to have a diversity of minds in the workplace? And so there are 4 ways in which most of us learn. There's some, visual learning through images, graphics, flow charts. Then those that another learning style is auditory. So what you hear, you're learning through listening. So for people who love podcasts, who love audiobooks, that's auditory learning. Third is reading and writing. So reading something and taking in the information through reading or even writing, taking notes that helps us learn. And then kinesthetic, which is learning by doing, hands-on. So all of us learn, through all of these modes. However, all of us typically have one preferred learning style. For me, I'm much more of a visual learner. Having graphs and charts really help me to absorb the information. And so it was mentioned before, thinking about universal design in schools, this is something that classrooms are built around. And now we're, wanting to see how do we bring this to the workplace. So an example at a really high level, again, I love cooking, and this is just one way of considering what universal design looks like. So you could have your recipe that's just all written out in text. Better yet, you can add numbering here. So we're gonna, divide the steps into 3. Or for me, especially as a visual learner, it really helps me to have a visual cue with the words of, what this recipe is supposed to look like. Better yet, it shows me the process and what it should look like as I'm going. And so this is, what could be considered an accommodation, but something that we always encourage companies to look at. How do you, present information in the organization, especially with work tasks? Can we show a finished product so that, a new hire or any employee knows what they're working towards? Things that seem so simple, and I know is not new for any of us, but can make such a huge difference, especially for those that are in our neurodiverse community. So it was mentioned before about, information processing differences. And this is where the brain develops in these different ways. As you're sitting here listening to me speak, there's a lot of processes your brain is going through. And again, I know I'm speaking to the experts here, so I might have to be corrected in this, but we share this to explain, especially in companies, about these differences and what it could look like. So auditory processing, I see this a lot in our community, where hearing what I'm saying right now, that the brain takes a little bit longer to provide a response to what I'm saying. And so it's allowing that time for someone to provide an answer. Being okay with what people call awkward silence, right? Just allowing someone a little extra time to provide an answer to the question. This is especially important in interviews, and not filling the space when it is, that time of silence, but really allowing someone to hear what you said and provide an answer. Sensory processing, we talked about this earlier, as you're sitting here, you are feeling the chair you're sitting in, the mouse you're touching, the keyboard, your brain's processing all of that. For some who have a sensory overload, being aware of that in a space or in an office. Visual processing, so as you're hearing me talk, you are also visually processing what is on the screen, you're reading these words, and your brain is processing all of this at once. And then emotional regulation, we're all showing up today with different feelings. And I think, especially with the pandemic, I think companies are still adjusting and trying to figure out how to really embrace the human aspects of who we are, and they're being forced to. And it's exciting because people really are the greatest asset in a company. And, I think this is where organizations are struggling, trying to figure out, how do we be respectful of how people are showing up to the workplace and being mindful of that. And I know Chris is going to talk to us about that shortly. But these things all encompass who we are and how we show up to work and how we're productive. And so when we consider these things, especially for our neurodivergent community, we can really build more equity and inclusion. I talk about, the pandemic and how there's so much to learn about our community and to really learn empathy through the pandemic. I remember in the first few weeks, I was asked a lot, how is your community being affected by this? And when I spoke to individuals, they were saying, the social isolation and, kind of figuring out like, how do we even interact with one another? Like, how far is 6 feet apart? Do I hug you? Do I need to wear a mask? Like, how are you feeling comfortable in this situation? This is a lot of the type of social anxiety that our community has felt and lived with for so long. And them sharing with me that when they're in social context, they're always worried about like, how are they presenting themselves? How am I making the other person feel? And trying to learn that. And I think it's really important for us to pause and think about what we've seen and how we're learning that ourselves, and to remember that if we do meet someone who's neurodivergent. And, a lot of these other things you see on the screen, disruption in our routines, mental health and stress, isolation, and even the sensory challenges that we can all start to relate to. And so the biggest thing that we advise companies with, and I would even bring to higher education, is the barriers in the interview process. Because interviews are set up to be so socially based, it's all about my verbal communication skills and how strong I am in persuading you that I'm the best candidate for this job, for this school, that I'm solely relying on that. And we know that for many in our neurodivergent community, that verbal communication may not be a strength. And so we talk to companies about building a more equitable process that is more skills based. And so this is just to make everyone aware of, like, you know, when we do training on to HR teams and hiring managers, we want to bring up, you know, how the communication style might be different of our community, to start to acknowledge and hopefully remove some of the bias that comes in verbal communication. First is that information processing speed, allowing for that pause for individuals to provide an answer. I've been telling all of our recruiters, when you ask an interview question, type it into the chat. It's really helpful for those who may be processing through words to see it visually. And so I can provide my best answer instead of keeping that question in mind. And then, you know, this happens to me all the time, like, oh my gosh, what did they just ask me? We'll put it into the chat, right? That helps any job candidate be successful, but especially those in our community. Verbal communication differences. Noticing that many in our community might have a different pace in which they speak, or a tone of voice. It might be more monotone and single tone, and recited. You know, for our community, practicing interview questions, it's hard to keep, as mentioned, things in mind, or even answering something on the spot and thinking about something in an ambiguous way, that, you know, you might see a difference in that communication. Less or wandering eye contact. So sensitivity in sight, which could lead to not making direct eye contact, and be wandering. And then social anxiety. Interviews are really nerve-wracking. And so you might notice certain habits, you might notice some stimming, and, you know, being really hard on themselves, because I think so much of our community have been told their whole lives, you're different, you need accommodations. And so they come to an interview and all of these things are still present. So how do we really think about setting psychological safety and making an interview not so nerve-wracking? That's what I really try to promote to companies, especially because most jobs, you do not find yourself in this stressful of a situation where you have to answer a question that you weren't prepared for. We usually send agendas before meetings. We know why we're coming to a meeting. Why are we setting up an interview to be any different when we know that people are not as high performing in those situations? So it's really thinking about things differently, and how we promote what we're looking for in our talent. And this is the biggest thing that we encourage for companies: an equitable interview format that is skills-based. You see this a lot in IT and engineering jobs, which is all about showing your skill set for the job, and measuring candidates by, you know, actually demonstrating their skills for the job. And we believe that this reduces bias and increases equity for all candidates. In fact, we know that it does. And so, you know, this is where I have the biggest aha moments from the hiring teams that we work with. Recruiters who tell me, oh my gosh, I have been in this job doing recruiting for 20 years, and they're almost in tears realizing how many candidates they have overlooked because of the emphasis on verbal communication skills. And this type of interview format, really, for those that are more technical and more comfortable, that this actually opens them up to a better conversation for that traditional interview, because they've been able to show you their skills. They're coming in from a strengths-based perspective. So, you know, there's a lot that can be talked about in neurodiversity. I want to be cognizant of time and our next speaker, but, you know, the key pillars to this: one is a foundation of inclusive leadership, you know, psychological safety, and these inclusive interview formats, and also, you know, leaders who are understanding the need to approach work differently. So we're here to help. We would love to expand talent sourcing to include individuals that are neurodivergent. We provide training and consulting. And for anyone who is a job seeker or works with students who are seeking for jobs, we would love to connect with them, intake resumes. And we have workshops that we do, but also connections to job opportunities with companies that are invested in neurodiversity inclusion. So we're short on time, so I'm gonna just stop here, and maybe we'll have time later to answer questions, or I'll respond in the chat. But thank you so much for everyone's time and being here.
Jessica, thank you. There is a question in the chat. If you could respond to that, that would be great. I want to thank you for this presentation because, as a university, it gives us a lot of things to consider, especially, particularly in terms of not only our accommodations, but also even our application process. So, thank you for giving us, this food for thought today. I want to move into our next presentation by introducing Angela Carroll. Angela is currently earning her MBA from Johns Hopkins Carey Business School with a concentration in healthcare management, innovation, and technology. Before pursuing her degree at Carey, she worked in direct patient care as a psychology associate and clinical research assistant at Johns Hopkins Hospital. While at JHH, she worked on clinical research projects and evaluated patients for psychiatric and neurologic conditions to aid in diagnosis and treatment planning. Her interest in collecting and analyzing quantitative data to diagnose and assess presenting concerns with patients led her to apply the same analytical expertise to strategy consulting projects at Carey. She has a passion for strategically assessing business concerns and helping businesses thrive, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned. Currently, Angela is serving a one-year term as co-president for Women in Business. She oversees the Community Empowerment and Action Pillar, which focuses on Carey's external partnerships and business relations with the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. area. Angela, welcome.
Thanks so much, Roger. Happy to be here. Good morning and happy Friday. Thank you all for joining in on today's session of Carey's DEIB Summit. I'm excited to introduce Carissa, who will be speaking about health and wellness. Carissa is a second-generation Filipino American. She is a leadership and business coach, founder of Conscious Exchange, which is an equity-focused consulting firm for the BIPOC entrepreneur group. She's also the co-founder of AA Rise, which focuses on promoting justice and healing for the AAPI community, which focuses on all of the healing that we can promote right now during this difficult times. Carissa holds a coaching certification in emotional intelligence, and I'm excited to see what she will share with us today. So please welcome Carissa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angela. And just give me 1 second as I also pull up my slides. Here we go. All right, everyone can see that. Like I said, thanks, Angela, for the introduction, and Roger and the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School for this invitation to speak to you all today. When I first became a DEI professional, I really underestimated how important taking care of my own mental and emotional health and wellness was as I entered this space. And I do identify as Asian American, I identify as Filipino American. And this identity alone really has an impact on my mental health, especially in the last couple of years. And even in the last few months of 2022, I've been getting this question pretty often. And the question is, are there still attacks happening against the Asian American community or Asian community? Because I'm not really seeing any reports in the news, and what are the stats, right? And I get a little taken aback when I hear this question because, this is coming from DEI champions, allies, even other Asians. And I'm hearing this immediately confused because at least there have been 3 stories in national headlines that have impacted me tremendously. And, Michelle Go, the woman who was pushed to her death in the New York City subway in February of 2022. There's Christina Yuna Lee, who was violently murdered in her own home in February 2022. And just a couple of weeks ago, we were honoring the anniversary of the Atlanta spa shooting where 8 people died, 6 of whom were Asian women. So the intent of this question, I know, may not be malicious, but perhaps these stories don't really impact you. They don't show up on your news feeds. Maybe you're not reading Next Shark like I am on a daily basis. But for many Asian Americans, Asian American women, especially ones who are living in New York City at this time, we do see the stories, right? We are Michelle Go. We are Christina Unili. And we are angry, we're anxious, and we're afraid. I'm already getting triggered just even talking about it. But not only are these stories triggering, just being asked, is this even still happening, is also something that can be very triggering. And so what are we doing about this? Asians are the least likely racialized group in the US to seek mental health services. And there are several different kind of reasons for this. You know, and it could be barriers such as stigma and shame, that there's this kind of cultural, familial kind of fear of bringing this up to our family. There's the model minority myth that says we can't show weakness. We must uphold this idea of being strong and smart and successful. There's language barriers, insufficient healthcare coverage, unawareness and lack of access, right? There's alternative treatments, acupuncture, other Eastern remedies that we might go to first. And then even if we do decide, hey, you know what, I do need help, I do want to seek out services, there's an underrepresentation of Asian and BIPOC therapists even for us to seek out and to go to, who have a more cultural understanding of what we are experiencing in our own lived experiences. So when you see me, you may see an Asian woman. And in the context of today, you might see a DEI professional. But what you might not see is that I'm also an Asian woman who worries about her elderly parents who are aging, and also with, you know, the climate of all this Asian hate, I'm fearful of their wandering in the world, right? I'm a Filipino American woman who has generational internalized racialized trauma that is stored in my body. I'm a woman who has physically attacked in LA when I was in the dark, when I was just on my way home. Sorry. I am also a DEI practitioner. And so I daily put myself in a position where I can be triggered, and I choose this emotional labor to support others with their own racialized trauma, with their own intergenerational traumas, and teaching folks about heavy topics like racism and xenophobia. I'm also a content creator who is vulnerable to attacks online daily. And I'm an entrepreneur who is also working through burnout. So on top of all these things as well, I'm also human. I'm dealing with personal things and deaths, cancer, miscarriages, and such within my circle. So there's a lot that I am personally managing, and I know that you all are as well. And regardless of what our colleagues and our friends and our family see on the surface, there are things that we are managing and needing to deal with. Just looking at the chat to see what's going on here. So what I want to bring to you today is that I am certified in emotional intelligence. This is something that I was really adamant about when I was the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Zappos a few years ago. That how are we going to hear like what other opinions are, what other experiences are from other folks if we don't really know what's going on for ourselves? And so my studies or my certification is with 6seconds.org. I'm just going to take you through a little bit of the framework that they teach in their studies. So the emotional intelligence is broken down into 3 pursuits. So it's know yourself, choose yourself, and give yourself. Know yourself is being able to really clearly see and feel what you do. And it's really this collection of data, right? When we think about EQ, we're thinking about emotions. So really understanding it's just information that we're collecting, right? And these competencies really allow us to think about what we're going to do next with this information. That takes us to choose yourself. So in intentionally choosing how we're going to respond to a situation, or rather than how we're going to react, right? How often do we sometimes kind of like say things that we don't really mean because we're not really understanding what's going on and like noticing what's going on, and then we just say something, right? And then the third one is giving yourself. So once we're able to kind of self-assess, be self-aware, we're able to choose how we're going to react to respond to a certain situation. Then these are ways that we can start to think about like and empathize with other folks and what they might be experiencing. So knowing yourself, choosing yourself, give yourself, there's 8 different competencies within these. I'm not really going to focus on all of this today in the interest of time. But what I'll go through is just the beginning part, just the know yourself part, because this is quite critical. And then my work with folks, we're not really able to articulate what is going on for us in any given moment. And so the two pursuits or the two competencies here really are developing emotional literacy. So being able to simply name your emotions, and then the naming of them are really just help to us to self-regulate, help us to kind of dispel like some of the, or do regulate some of the kind of strong emotions we might be having. So, and then recognizing patterns also allows us to see, hey, where is this, am I being triggered right now? Is this something that's reoccurring? Is there a pattern in how, I respond to a certain person, a situation, even certain place, right? And again, this is all information collecting, data gathering, right? So that we can more accurately or better choose a response rather than being reactive. So the Wheel of Emotions, I don't know if anyone's really heard of this, you can Google this, and it literally gives you some more language around being able to express what you are feeling, express what you are dealing with at any given moment. I don't know how any of you showed up today, what has happened at work already, what was happening before you came into the workplace, right? And so this sometimes it's a tool. Sometimes we're only able to name like 3 emotions. Sometimes we're able to name I'm sad or I'm happy or I'm angry, right? But there's a spectrum of that, like, and how the intensity of how we feel a certain emotion or a certain feeling, right? And so being able to have more more accurately articulate how we're experiencing something. So maybe we're afraid, but really it's because we're nervous about something, right? Or we're feeling when we're angry, maybe we're jealous or we're bitter. So the more accurate it is, the more we're able to kind of understand, where is this coming from? Why is this happening? So I don't like to also give presentations where I'm just speaking at you. So I know we're kind of coming to the middle of the day before your next kind of keynote. And so I wanted to take a little second here to go through more of an exercise that helps us kind of, again, notice what is going on for us. And it's a body scan. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with doing a body scan or have done a body scan, but really kind of slowing your day down. We've been through a couple of presentations now, been listening a lot. And I'd like you to just kind of think about, like, how are you feeling? And so if you can join me in this really quick exercise, we'll just take you through a quick body scan. You can turn off your cameras if they're still on. You're welcome to close your eyes if that feels comfortable for you. But really just starting to start with the top of your head, right? And just to breathe. Take one big breath. And at the top of your head, starting to see, okay, what am I feeling? Is there anything going on in my head? Right? Do my temples hurt? Do my cheeks hurt? Coming down to your shoulders and to your neck. A lot of our tension and our stress is carried in our shoulders and our neck, right? Is that activated for you right now? We look at our limbs and going down to our arms, even to our hands and our fingers. Do we feel any sensations as we feel into our hands? And then even taking that to our chest. How's your heart feeling? How's your back? Going down to your stomach even. Do you notice any sensations in your stomach? Low back, another place where we store a lot of stress. Going down to our hips and through our legs. Where might you be feeling something? And even down finally to your feet and your toes. Again, any tingling, any sensations that may be coming up. And as you just do one more quick scan, one more big breath in and out. And wherever you may be feeling something, you can put your hands on that spot and just breathe into that and give that area some love. And And from there, you might be able to start noticing where in your body there might be some tension, there might be some tenderness that needs some attention from you. Our bodies are so wise. And sometimes we go to our minds to kind of tell us, how are we feeling, right? But our bodies know almost immediately what is going on for us. And you can see that when you are, say, giving a presentation, right? And you might feel some butterflies in your stomach because you're nervous. When you're about to go into a meeting, right? And maybe your palms are sweating automatically. It's not something you're very cognitive. You're not talking about it, thinking about it. It's just happening. When you might be in a room with someone that makes you uncomfortable, you might not even know this person, but even your body language. Are you facing this person and you turning away? Are you kind of a little bit of distance from this person, right? So noticing when we're talking about self-awareness, we're not just thinking about what are we feeling, where we articulate those emotions, but even what our body is doing. Because that all, again, it's all this information that we're using and collecting so that we can take that next step of choosing what we want to do with that information. So from this just past exercise, assess that current situation. Like, what emotion did you experience? You can drop it in the chat if you feel like that. Maybe there was something that happened this morning that you've already gone through that is creating some emotions for you. Could be joyful ones too. Maybe there was something super exciting, great news that you got this morning that is causing some feelings in you. And you can use that emotions wheel for you to be able to articulate that, right? And where did you feel that in the body? Can you name where might you be experiencing or feeling some tension, some tenderness? And then from there, also saying, okay, well, what is causing me to feel this way? What did happen? What was the situation? Who was involved? And if it was something harder, was this triggering something from the past? You saw me get a little emotional just talking about some of the women who have been attacked in New York City, right? I lived in New York City. A lot of that commute and a lot of those experiences were ones that I had in my daily life. And so it's very real for me, right? So where's anything that you have experienced this morning triggering something from the past? And again, from that information gathering, you can then begin to choose what you want to do with that and really prioritize your mental health and well-being. So choosing yourself could look like talking with a trusted friend. It could look like just going for a walk, going to the gym. Maybe, and sometimes when there's real anger and rage in your system, punching a pillow could be really helpful. Screaming into a pillow can be really helpful. What we just did was a little quick meditative breath, like in body scan exercise. Maybe that's something that is helpful for you, depending on, where you are in your day and where you are, right? Going on a vacation, maybe you do know that day off. A lot of us busy, ambitious career folks don't take the day off, don't take vacation, right? Maybe that's something that we have to book. Dancing, singing, taking a nap. And often, we're very social creatures, and how many times, especially with all the social isolation we've been in, do you just want to hug? Something so simple, right? And so I share all this in terms of that information gathering piece and like thinking about how we might be able to self-soothe, how we might be able to take care of ourselves, how to prioritize ourselves. Because the other part of that, once we're able to kind of see what's going on for us, we'll be able to extend more of that curiosity, care, tenderness towards other folks, right? What might someone else be feeling right now? If this is how I might be experiencing just my few hours of this morning, could someone else possibly also be having an experience? When we're interacting with one another as colleagues, right? And maybe we're disappointed with a missed deadline, being late for a meeting. Are we assuming or judging this person for that? Or are we leaning in with more kind curiosity and saying, okay, what might be happening for this person, right? I very much identify, again, as a pretty strong, independent, bold, outspoken person. And there are things in my life and triggers, right? Such as the stories of the Asian American community that can get to me and that can throw me into my own kind of reactive and like emotional response just by hearing a story, right? And that could cause some longer term effects, right? Or that could cause some different reactions that I might not necessarily intend in the workplace, right? And so I bring this up because maybe we can be better about being empathetic, being compassionate, asking, wondering what might be going on for our friends, our colleagues, our family members, and what can we do to support while still also honoring our own boundaries and capacity. And I think this is especially important for folks in the DEI space, right? A lot of the work we do is heavy. I think this is especially important too, as a woman of color, as a person of color, that simply walking around, doing our daily business can cause, can cause some triggers, can be violent and dangerous actually in some cases. I think with the 2020 George Floyd's murder in 2020, the anti-Asian hate has also exacerbated what is already a daily burden for us walking around in the world. And many of us here are business students, we're professionals, we're entrepreneurs. And so not also dismissing that we are carrying lots of stress and pressure from our workplaces, from our own businesses that we are running, right? We're all still dealing with this global pandemic and the looming uncertainties that come with that. And at the end of the day, we're all just humans seeking love and belonging and trying to live our lives in community with one another. So I share that it's a quick just overview of EQ, but I know Jessica had kind of said that there's experience in what workplaces are really trying to do these days is how do we become more human? How do we start to see each other, not just as colleagues, right? But as people, as individuals, living in the world, just trying to get by sometimes, right? We have no idea what is going on within, outside of these workplaces. And so I love this quote from Grace Lee Boggs, but to make a revolution, people must not only struggle against existing institutions, they must make a philosophical, spiritual leap and become more human beings. In order to change and transform the world, they must change and transform themselves. And so I ask you, for you all, to also think about what is going on for you, what might be going on for other folks, and how can we do better together. So that's my quick presentation. My name again is Carissa Begonia. You can find me at consciousexchange.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn as well. And yeah, thank you very much for having me.
I'm so glad that you came and presented. Your presentation was so inspirational. Thank you for being here. Are there any questions for Carissa? Anything at all? Or comments? I think the body scan was very popular, especially on a Friday as we roll into the weekend. So.
I'll say that we don't take time for ourselves. And a lot of this, what I'm talking about today, I'm not a therapist. I am someone who is very much, I talk a lot about emotional regulation because of my EQ background, but I think I really then underestimated how much we would need this as DEI professionals. There's a lot of burnout in this field, right? And I think you're seeing these stories, whether that is Asian related, but just racialized stories of what's going on in the reality of the world, right? And so if we're not understanding what's going on for ourselves, right, how are we going to even have an opportunity to hear what's going on for someone else, right? And so I think it's really important. When I started doing this work, and again, I was pretty adamant about this being foundational when I was the head of DEI at Zappos, so that we could have dialogue. We have to move into a place where we're speaking to each other, right? And again, if we're not in a place where we can regulate, right? And it's not to dismiss the emotion, it's not to get rid of it, it's not to downplay it, right? It's to acknowledge it actually, because oftentimes I think we do not. And we wonder why we're going about our business and we're activated, right? And then again, we're reactive. And so the more information we have, the better we understand what's going on for ourselves. Again, we can start to look at the world a little bit differently and start to look at our friends, colleagues, like family members a little bit differently and be curious, like what might be going on? Because I know that how many times do you think about, I wish someone just cut me some slack. I wish someone just looked at me and said, hey, are you okay? And, especially as leaders, right? There's an expectation that we show up that we're strong, that we have it all together, right? I didn't expect to kind of get emotional in this presentation in the beginning. I'll be frank, it threw me off a little, right? And I've been talking about this subject many, many times. This is not new for me, right? And I think that's the other thing is when we're asked, hey, racialized trauma sits with us for years, forever. It doesn't go away, right? So when we're expected to operate and just move on, it's kind of an unrealistic expectation, you know. When things are not in the news headlines, when they're not in this, then we don't see it. It doesn't mean that we don't feel it still, right? And it's not that we can predict when something's going to come up, right? And so that is my just call for everyone, is to start to really understand what is going on for yourself. Spend more time. I know time sometimes is really hard to create for oneself. But it was very intentional for me to say, like, let's take a minute and do a body scan, because 2 minutes, whatever long it took, right? How often do you actually do that for yourselves? You know,
Yeah.
so I invite you to take that walk, to take that breather, could take a minute, right? But that could also reset you into another place for when you can continue on to the next thing until you can go home, right? And take a bubble bath, right? if that is even
Yeah.
for some of us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like the idea of self-acceptance and self-love, and the idea like once we love ourselves, then we can extend that love to those people around us, or the understanding we have for ourselves, you know, then we can really spread that out and empathize. I think, did Nalene have a question? It kind of looks like it might be a question, or do you want to kind of talk out loud?
How do you approach someone who takes pride in being a Mr. Spock with controlled emotions that distance them? We can't control other people, right? And we would love to ask and find out what's going on for everyone. I think the fact that you were just even noticing that, Nalene, how do you pronounce your name? And if that is creating something, you know, creating some emotions within you, that's really interesting. That is your own data for yourself and how you might need to approach this person, work with this person, right? And it's tough, right? Because we can only make, again, decisions for ourselves. So I don't know what your relationship is to this Mr. Spock, right? If they are your boss, right? It might be harder to avoid or to walk away, create your boundaries. But also sometimes people who are most stoic, I'll just say it, from Asian culture, right? There is a stoicism that we uphold. There is this, we don't talk a lot about emotions more generally, right? In our families even. So we're not practicing this. And so it could be even a simple question of, how are you doing, right? Because we might just assume that that's how you are, that's how you show up into every situation that I've been in with you, and that's just your MO. But I'm curious, you know, sometimes, does anyone ask, right? And so I don't know if that helps. It's probably a very specific kind of situation. It's all different. It's all situational. But I think, again, leading with that kind curiosity. Is there did I give it a benefit of the doubt? Can I try? But also protecting your own self, right? Like I said, when I talked about your body responding, there's some kind of maybe automatic, some maybe distancing that could be happening, right? And again, that's a choice whether or not that you want to honor that and say, like, I don't feel safe or I don't feel comfortable myself. This is not a choice I want to make to engage. Or, hey, I can move past this. Let's inquire, let's ask, because that does feel safe if I just move past my discomfort. So it's all situational. And I think, again, why like the data collection part of this is so important, because at least you can have all that information to make your best informed decision. You're not always going to get it right? But I think, again, this as I've been working with clients, people don't know how to articulate what's going on for them. They're not paying attention to their bodies. I think, again, our work, hustle culture, toxic capitalism has made us just go. And so we're not paying attention to what's going on for us when we actually do know internally and inherently. And so I just invite you all to pause a little bit more and kind of assess, and then you can make better choices.
Yeah, Carissa has great points, and also just being patient. Like she mentioned, we don't know who Mr. Spock is in relation to you, but patience is always helpful, and love, compassion. Does anyone else have any other questions for Carissa? I'm so glad that you came today. Thank you so much for being here. Roger might take us home.
Yeah. Carissa, thank you for your sharing your authentic story with us. But on a Friday also, I really want to thank you for that exercise. You know, I am a big advocate of self-care, and just taking the time on a Friday, you know, as we move into the weekend, to go through that body scan exercise. You know, maybe somebody will take it with them this weekend and really, you know, be more self-reflective. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us for our 4th annual DEIB Summit. I want to thank all the comments that we had in the chat. I don't know if you probably didn't get a chance to look at them, Carissa, but you know, everyone was really appreciative of that exercise. So thank you for taking us or guiding us through that. So with that said, I want to respect everyone's time. We are at the top of the hour. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for doing the exercise with us. And our final session is at noon. I hope you join us for the fireside chat with the dean. And if not, enjoy your weekend and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.